friends, in the new series on history of India from 1700 to 1950, in the earlier lecture we talked about the introduction, and in that we tried to cover the syllabus of this particular paper, where we talked about the various kinds of developments during this particular period, that how British, when they came to India, so they introduced three kinds of capitalism, beginning from mercantile, industrial and finance capitalism, and how the 18th century is being seen by the various scholars, the kind of changes which happened in the 18th century in India, and how it was seen as a dark age, and how it was rejected by the revisionist historians that it was not a dark age. We also talked about the various kinds of methods which were employed by the British in a way to secure more and more revenue for themselves, and we also talked about the subsidy line system in the doctrine of lapse, the kind of policies which are followed by the British for their political benefit. We also talked about the Orientalism, evangelicalism and utilitarianism, the various kinds of policies in the framework of ideological positions which were being used by the British for their own interests in the context of India, and the various kinds of revenue settlements and the commercialization of agriculture, and how deindustrialization, which was a result of the British colonial policies, and the social religious reform movements, they were all being talked about in the framework of the kind of changes which were to be brought about in the Indian society. And now we'll talk about the further kind of developments which happened in the Indian society when we talk about this particular paper from History of India 1700s to 1950. And we realized that one of the momentous events in the framework of this particular era in the context was the revolt of 1857 and the various kinds of causes, where we find that the issue of greased cartridges was the most important cause for the revolt of 1857. And when you tend to see it in the framework of the military causes, we realize that how the mistreatment which was being given to the soldiers of that time, and how they were also being refused to pay bhatta when they were in a way fighting in the distant lands. So we find that how the military factors were important, then the economic factors in the framework of that, how the various classes of Indian society, whether the agriculturalists and others, they were in a way under the grip of the Sarkar, Sahukar and Zamindar. So this kind of a triumvirate was in a way trying to suppress the peasants, those who were in large numbers, because around 70% of the people, they were engaged in the agricultural and other primary kind of activities. We also realized that other sections of the society, they also were suffering from the economic point of view during the colonial period, as many of the Indian posts in the higher administration, they were not being allowed to the Indians, and even in the army as well as the civil administration as well. We also talked about the various kinds of causes in the framework of the subsidy line system introduced by Wellesley in 1799, or the doctrine of lapse by Lord Dalhousie, and which were the important political factors. And we find that how British, they interfere in the social practices like sati, child marriage, widow remarriage, which was not even liked, which was not liked by certain sections of the society, and these sections, they became or they turned against the British. So when you talk about the various kinds of causes of the revolt of 1857, we realize that the different factors, social, economic, cultural, political, all of them, they played an important role in the revolt of 1857. And when one is talking about the nature of the revolt, then we find that scholars, they've tried to see it from different perspective, whether some have called it as the Sepoy Mutiny, others have seen it as the first war of independence, and V.D. Savarkar was the first one to point out that it was the war of independence against the colonial rule. Others have seen it in the framework of the civil rebellion, and how this civil rebellion in a way was an important concern of that particular period when different sections of society rose against the British. Some have called it as a religious war, and others have tried to see it in the framework of a conspiracy as well. But one important aspect with regard to the revolt of 1857 was that how it played an important role in the framework of an inspiration, and how the people, they came out to defy a mighty colonial empire. So it was very important from the point of view of the national movement as well, where the later the people, those who got associated with the national movement, they tried to see 1857 as the first, in a way, war of independence, where they wanted to use it, the revolt of 1857, as some kind of an inspiration for their fight against the colonial rule in future. So from that point of view, 1857 definitely played an important role, and how this this revolt in a way alerted the British as well, so that they become more cautious in their dealings with the Indians thereafter. So we also see that how the period from 1885 onwards, which is the period of the nationalist politics as well, we find that how from 1858 to 1947 various kinds of organizations they came up during this particular period, with the foundation of the Indian National Congress, and how it had the different phases, the moderates from 1885 to 1907, and how they were engaged in the policy of the petition, prayer and protest. And they also believed in the British sense of justice, and we find that how the moderates, the various kinds of demands which were being made by the moderates at this point of time, whether they were talking about the separation of the executive and the judiciary, the Indianization of the civil services, and the condition of indentured labor, and trial by jury. So all these kinds of demands, they were quite progressive. And at the same time, we find the reign of wealth theory given by Dadabhai Naoroji. It also played an important role, in the sense that how Indians, they realized that how the wealth from India was going out by the various policies which were followed by the British. So many times it is being talked about that how the kind of demands which we had talked about with reference to the moderates, and how moderates, they were a progressive lot. They were not only talking about what was happening in India, but at the same time they were also conscious about the indentured labor which was going out of India, and they were also talking about the Indianization of the civil services, and how civil services was playing an important role at that point of time, was also talked about by the moderates, and how they said that when the civil services, they will be Indianized, then they will be more humane, they will be more responsive, they will be more empathetic towards the Indians, because they would be aware about the issues of the Indians and their problems. So the critique in the framework which was given by Dadabhai Naoroji in the context of the drain of wealth was an important contribution to the national movement, from not only from the economic point of view, but also from an overall perspective as well. Then we also see that apart from the revolt of 1857, which definitely played an important role, we also find that how the coming of the moderates in the initial phase, because when the emergence of the Congress took place, it was being talked about that how Congress it was created by the British themselves. It was some sort of a safety valve. It was operating as a safety valve for the British, in the sense that any kind of discontent or disenchantment which is there in the society at that point of time could be in a way realized by the British through any kind of an organization. And we find that some of the scholars, they have talked about in the framework that if British, they wanted to use it as a safety valve, then the people, those who were there in the Congress, they used the British as some sort of a lightning conductor. So this is being also talked about, and thereafter we also see that another phase of the Congress politics was in the framework of the extremists, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal. All of them, these were the extremist leaders known as the Lal Bal Pal, and they were critical of the mendicancy of the moderates, and Tilak said that Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it. And we also see that how the extremists, they excessively glorified the ancient heritage of India, and they also deified, they also in a way worshipped the nation in that sense. So it was being talked about that this kind of an deification of nation, where a nation is being seen as some kind of a god or goddess, then it will alienate the other sections of the societies. So apart from the moderates, apart from the extremists, we also see the phase of the revolutionaries at different points of time, and they believed in individual heroism, and they were seen to be some sort of heroes, and they were also disillusioned with the British government, and they used violence to achieve their objectives. And because of this, we find that they attacked on the various government officials or treasuries. And in the later part, we find that some of the known revolutionaries were Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Rajguru, Ashfaqullah, etc., who sacrificed themselves for the country. But before that also, we find that revolutionaries, they were active in the first decade of the 20th century as well, and how individual heroism was an important concern of these revolutionaries, and because of their participation, some kind of a thrust to the national movement was given, and how people, they could also realize that how some of the people were ready to sacrifice their own lives for the sake of country. Then we also see that after that, Mahatma Gandhi and mass nationalism, that's the period which is being talked about, and Gandhian ideas, techniques and movements, they took some kind of a precedence over other things, and for example, Satya and Ahimsa, they were being considered to be the twin pillars on which Gandhian philosophy rested. And he talked about the means and ends, he also talked about the beliefs and practice, and at the same time he was steadfast on the idea of satyagraha, and he wanted to deploy fast as a technique by which all the objectives with regard to the national movement, they could be realized. So this phase of Gandhian politics in the Indian context is seen to be an era of mass nationalism, that how Gandhi, when he came to India in 1915, and thereafter he visited India in a train, and saw the kind of poverty in which India was there, and then he realized that that when people were so poor and they needed a lot of support and help, and the introduction of khadi, for example, or the charkha, they were an important concern for the Indians, that how they can weave their own cloth. So it was not a symbol of only economic self-sufficiency, but at the same time it was also a rejection of the British goods as well, that the and that the cloth which was being imported from Britain for India was to be rejected by the Indians when they were weaving their own cloth. So Gandhi definitely believed in these kinds of ideals of means and ends, that how you have to have fair means so that fair ends could be achieved. And Gandhi, in a way, generally in the context that whatever he believed, whatever he talked about, he generally practiced them as well. So this gap of belief and practice could not be seen in the Gandhian ideals, and the kinds of techniques which were being employed by Mahatma Gandhi in the framework of satyagraha, for example, or fasts, etc., they were also being in a way appreciated by the masses, and at the same time, being because of their non-violent nature, we find that there was a lot of support, because many people, they were not in a way ready to have any kind of a violence in the context of the fight against the British Empire, because they also realized that how British, with their might, with their weapons, they would be able to in a way crush them. And when you talk about the Gandhian phase, we also talk about the various kinds of movements which were led by Gandhi, which made Gandhi as a Mahatma in that sense, how in a way he was referred as Mahatma by an entire generation and thereafter. We also see that the Champaran Satyagraha was the first satyagraha which was launched by Gandhi against the Tin Kathiya system on the indigo cultivation, that how farmers, they were being forced by the people, those who were in a way dominating them, those who were providing them all sorts of support to grow indigo. And so such kind of coerciveness was being in a way imposed on the cultivators for growing indigo. Then we also see that Gandhi also in a way intervened in the Ahmedabad mill strike, where 35 wage increase for the workers was given, and in Kheda also the no revenue campaign which was initiated also had support of Gandhi. So we find that the initial kinds of movements which were led by Gandhi in a way made him ready for a far greater movements in the later part, where we find that the Khilafat movement which was led by Gandhi at this point of time, which was in a way started with the Rowlatt Act, and how the Rowlatt Act agitation and the Khilafat agitation and the non-cooperation movement which was launched by Gandhi, they were some sort of continuity. There was a lot of continuity in these kinds of things. And when you talk about the Rowlatt Act, then the Act in a way conveys that no appeal, no wakil, and no dalil. And we also find that a number of hartals and demonstrations, they were being led during this time, so that they could in a way protest against this Rowlatt Act. And we also see that Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which was also a part in the framework of the Rowlatt Act, that how British, they used their might to kill so many people in Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, and how these people, those who were defenseless, the people, those who were not carrying any arms, the people, those who were protesting in a peaceful manner, they were being massacred by the butcher at that point of time, uh, who is being in a way supported even by the British people, that they collected money for him. So General Dyer, in that sense, who was the butcher of the Jallianwala Bagh, he did not even have any kind of a remorse in the later part, when he in a way says that he would have done the same thing. We also see that Gandhian movements in the framework of the Khilafat movement, non-cooperation, civil disobedience, where we find that the Dandi March was launched to defy the laws, and we find that a lot of women, they participated in this movement. And thereafter the Quit India movement, where Gandhi talks about do or die, and this movement was comparatively more violent in nature as well when you compare it with other Gandhian movements. And despite that, Gandhi did not call off the movement, because Gandhi says that the violence of the state was far greater than any kind of violence which was perpetrated by the people. So in that sense, we find that the various kinds of movements launched by Gandhi at different points of time, whether the non-cooperation in 1920, or civil disobedience in 1930, or Quit India in 1942, we find that Gandhi was also in a way engaged in a lot of constructive work as well, because he realized that when he will be engaged in the constructive work, he will in a way make others ready as and when he launches a movement. And it was also very important from the point of view of national reconstruction as well. And we find that such kind of Gandhian tactics paid in the longer run, because how a number of people, they could be mobilized. And we also find that apart from that, that was also a climate in 1940s. We find that America had become more dominant, and America was all, and both America as well as Russia, they were pushing for Indian independence in the changed scenario, where America and Russia, they were the major superpowers, and the authority of Britain, it also dwindled over a period of time. We also realized the contribution of the INA, Indian National Army, and how INA contributed in that sense, and the Royal Indian Navy mutiny as well. And when British realized that when they will not be able to control India, they will not be able to dominate India if the forces do not support them, and the Royal Indian Navy mutiny especially was very instrumental in that, where British realized that it will be very difficult for them to control India without any kind of an army support, which was the basis on which they were controlling the Indians. And we also see that during this time, the communal politics and the idea of partition was being talked about in 1940s, the Muslim League's politics in 1906, when it was initiated, and thereafter at different points of time was divisive in nature, and how League's demand was in the framework of Pakistan, where League says that they are demanding a separate homeland for themselves. We also see during this period the Hindi-Urdu controversy, and we find that the various sessions of the Muslim League at different points of time, they were also asking for the partition or a separate state. Then the way they unleashed violence through the direct action day was another important concerns of that time. And when we talk about partition, then we talk about various kinds of aspects of violence, displacement, refugees in their own country, and how people they got separated from their homeland, and the kind of pain which is being reflected in the various kinds of cinema of those times, and how partition has also been shown in the literature, theatre, cinema, all of them, and how we tend to understand partition in the modern times. And we also see that a partition museum is being established in Amritsar and Delhi, and how the partition museum is trying to convey the kind of horrors of partition of that particular period. We also see when India became independent in 1947, and how we were given we took this issue of the making of the Indian Constitution, and how Indian Constitution talks about the sovereignty of India, and how the socialist character was also being talked about, and words like socialist and secular, they were inserted in 1970s in the later part, though they were not part of the original constitution. And we also see that how the ideas of democracy and republic, they were very integral to the Indian constitution, and how the establishment of the Indian Republic was very important from the point of view of the national movement, that how people those who laid down their lives during the course of the national movement, and many of them, they could not see the light of the day, in the sense that many of them, they died as well. So we find that they could not see the Indian independence, but at the same time their contribution could not be in a way neglected, or could not be in a way seen to be lesser at that point of time, because all of them, they contributed in a certain measure. And how the various phases of the national movement, the ideas also evolved, that what exactly was wanted by the Indian nationalists from the British. So these kinds of things, they got reflected in the Indian constitution as well. And when you talk about the Indian constitution, we realize that it is a kind of a document which is one of the lengthiest constitutions of the world. And we also realize that this it is a written constitution, it is a document which is trying to in a way give to the Indians, because in the preamble of the constitution it is written that we the people of India give to ourselves. So that is one important thing, that how people, they are giving constitution to themselves, it is not being given to them by someone else. So in the framework of this particular paper, which begins from 1700s, we find that one has to understand or develop an understanding of the ideas of colonialism and imperialism, that how British through their policies brought about a sea change in the context of India. You also have to in a way understand the kind of exploitative character of the colonial rule, that when you will be able to understand the exploitative character of the colonial rule, then one will be able to realize that how Indians, they were being exploited at different times by the British. One also has to see that how the national movement, and when you see 1857 revolt as the first war of independence, and thereafter the various kinds of organizations which were established, in that sense we find that how the nationalist leaders, they played their part in the national movement, where they forced the British to think on different lines. And over a period of time, their contribution could also be seen in the framework of the achievements of the democratic society, where we find that the coming of the constitution and the various kinds of democratic ethos which are there in our constitution, which talk about parity for all, or removal of all sorts of distinction. So this paper would in a way try to provide you some kind of a framework from 1700 to 1950, and the various historical and other kinds of developments in the framework of the Indian society, polity, economy and culture. So with this I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.